What if I told you a dark goth anime online RPG styled after DFO and Gauntlet existed, that looked like what Persona could have been in some ways had it gone online, and then it was gone only after 3 years? Rusty Hearts might be the butt of many flatulence jokes. Okay, that was the last one for everyone included. But it has a long-lasting legacy despite being so short-lived, and not particularly well known at large. Rusty Hearts originally launched in the US and Korea sometime in 2011, and although it didn't wow the internet like some other titles we have covered, it easily introduced one of the more unique online RPG styles we have ever seen. Although Rusty Hearts would shut down in 2014, the game still manages to live on with its community on a private server. And anytime you see that, that means that there was some value in that online RPG and thus online world. My name is nerdSlayer, or you can call me NS, you know, my detective moniker. In this episode of Death of a Game, we diagnose the largest contributing factors to the death of Rusty Hearts through the traversal and usage of a timeline while searching for the clues and bits of evidence that pop up along the way. This ultimately culminates in a final deduction, every detective's favorite, where we crack the case. And without further delay, let's get to solving this case before moving on to yet another dying world or series for the next case. The story begins back in 2004, one of the greatest years of gaming. It would also be the early and humble beginnings of the developer, the star of this video, Stairway Games. Stairway Games began in Seoul, Korea, and although they only worked on smaller games and mostly mobile titles early on in their career, they would begin development on their upcoming major online RPG sometime in 2008. They would team up with a Korean publisher, Windysoft, to help them launch locally, who had some experience working with a previous online RPG dubbed Infinity Online. Stairway Games would, through the help of their Korean publisher, sign a licensing deal with none other than the Korean and Asian online RPG and virtual world developer and publisher, Perfect World Entertainment. I'm hearing a collective groan echo out amongst my audience now, as many of you likely know where this is headed next with this clue. Perfect World Entertainment, or PWE, even by 2011 had a less than stellar reputation of being a bit of a pump and dump style publisher / porter. They would do little to attract the confidence of aspiring new players in the case of Rusty Hearts. Yes, while they developed a game with the same name to some success, they were largely known as a Chinese publisher for other Chinese or even some Korean and Japanese online RPGs that would come to the West. The problem with this being, well, you're asking a publisher from a region with a strong support of microtransactions and mobile gaming these days to try and port a game and localize it for an audience that they never really showcased an understanding of. Except in making money by putting in the least amount of effort, much like other porters like Gamigo. Perfect World Entertainment would likely take a very similar approach that Windysoft was taking in Korea, with a few key differences going forward. So they would change some aspects for localization, but never enough. One of those aspects would be the endurance system that would be needed to continue to peruse and discover dungeons. When you run out of it, you can't dungeon crawl anymore. This would be removed in the localization process and later removed after the Korean version would launch. This was a key mobile gaming online RPG mechanic that many players, myself included, disliked greatly, so removing it was at least a step in the right direction. But when porting a game made for a different region as an online world, it's much more difficult than just changing one or two aspects of said world. Rusty Hearts would continue to its Korean launch first, as is customary for a Korean-based company launching an online RPG. However, the unique thing about Rusty Hearts was that the delay between them bringing the game from the east to the west wasn't an incredibly long one. This would hopefully speak to the quickness that the western regions would receive the updates the Korean server would receive first, which is always very crucial in the success of an online RPG being brought to another region. Rusty Hearts launched May 11, 2011 and would feature a free-to-play business model, where you would be able to play the initial characters in the game like Franz Kruger, Angela Strongen, and Tood McLeod for free, and then purchase the premium characters that would come at a later date. There would also be a cash shop, as quite customary with such games, that would include a number of pay-to-win aspects that people have continued to try to coyly argue against for many years, only increasing how rampant said monetization is. Pay-to-win is described as anything that gives you an advantage, and in Rusty Hearts you could purchase res scrolls, bonus XP, and stat scrolls, repair kits, and even special costumes or packages that granted benefits. This was quite normal fare for the Korean market, partly due to the black market being illegal in Korea and not just against the terms of service, but would such a cash shop be as well received when brought to the Western market? Historically, they hadn't been. GameSpot in the West would get their hands on the upcoming Korean online RPG Rusty Hearts at E3 2011. The gameplay would consist of choosing a pre-made character that would often have mixed roles, say a healer and a tank, or a DPS and a healer. And while this might sound alarming to MMO or even ORPG purists, the game was reportedly taking inspiration from the game's anime art style, and wanted to feature more anime-esque main characters to choose from and highlight. The combat is also non-typical, utilizing the arrow keys for movement and the keyboard for abilities, sort of like an RTS or even a beat 'em up. You can also combo with a meter tracking how many consecutive hits you would make. Rusty Hearts also supports controllers and gamepads, which would work incredibly well and was probably the targeted audience, or probably should have been. The world is described as a literal ORPG, where a hub zone exists and allows you to see and communicate with other players. Meanwhile, you would team up with them to take on numerous enemy types and difficulty level dungeons. These dungeons would include various enemy threats, including a few rare bosses that you would have to work together to take down. This was very typical ORPG, or Phantasy Star-like in design, common in online RPGs or online JRPGs, or most famously in the West, Guild Wars. The problem was, very much, Guild Wars and PSO, they would still be stiff competition at the time and were still quite powerful, having sequels on the horizon. Two sequels that made absolute waves for different reasons, but were unmistakably mega hits. Rusty Hearts would host a Western closed beta sometime in July of 2011, after the Korean launch, and then follow it up with another beta in August of 2011. Now, I've been saying the West an awful lot, and probably out of habit, but to be honest, Rusty Hearts never even launched entirely in the West. It only launched in NA. RH would launch September 20th, 2011, and shortly after launch on Steam as well. Unfortunately, it's been scrubbed from Steam, so I can't really see anything except the old updates, the community screenshots, and the videos. On aggregate review website Metacritic though, Rusty Hearts would score a 79 out of 100, which was pretty impressive given its little notoriety and it not being based on an established IP. Mind you, that was only from 6 reviewers and some of the lesser known reviewers as well. Still, the parts that GameSpot had highlighted the most seemed to strike true still, and ended up being people's favorite features of the game. The action almost beat 'em up style combo combat, which was likened to another title that launched at the same time, Vindictus, was the main attraction of the gameplay. While the visuals, which were always a favorite of many fans, were easily the most unique aspect of the game. The visuals I often compare to something like Persona, with a bit more of an anime look to it. Gothic anime was pretty untapped, though perhaps there was a reason for that. It's quite controversial, even at first glance, and the most popular MMOs and online RPGs historically have been rather broadly appealing, at least graphically. Even within more of the same genre as Rusty Hearts, titles like PSO and Guild Wars 1 exist, and are quite known for their graphical presentations even back in the day. The difference is they are far more appealing to a broader group of players, which is key when you're trying to attract a broader or bigger group of players. I think this is why sometimes players or people get confused when they see a game that has a unique and lovable art style and that fails to succeed with a broader populace, or in general. Because while there is people that clearly like that type of art style, there isn't enough in a general populace sense yet. And in order to establish that fact, or prove that that's the case, you would have to create a new style that was popular. And that's a lot harder to do than working in a pre-existing one. And beside that, the core of Rusty Hearts, which was, as described before, very much like an online RPG akin to PSO and Guild Wars 1, sadly just wasn't that impressive on its own right to save the rest of the game or the audience. Because even with the dungeon crawling aspects, which allow you to select different scaling missions with a chance for rare bosses to spawn in them and give you more loot, they are fairly rudimentary and don't innovate or even reach the standard of the previous Pioneer titles. I found the game way too easy personally, which was not a problem I felt when playing PSO so much even in the very early levels. On top of that, had Rusty Hearts actually taken some notes from Guild Wars 1 or PSO properly, they could have fleshed out their hub zone and side content more, and they wouldn't have had to rely so much on their combat and dungeons. And in the parts that they could have been different and unique, they just weren't. And the whole anime storyline based on characters bit is not an entirely bad idea, but my issue with it is that it basically removes the most important part of a virtual world, the player identity and customization. Now you're running around with very little ability to customize your character and thus identity, which shrinks your desire to play long term because it disrupts your immersion and identity, which is your connection to the world. Had they been able to pull off the anime-level storylines featuring these characters, perhaps things could have been entirely different, but then that would have had to mean they would have had a talented storytelling team akin to a literal anime, which just didn't seem to happen. So in the end, their shining design choice to feature a pre-selected anime hero style was just a resounding dud, because it failed to accomplish what they wanted to with it in the first place. And to make matters even worse, as I mentioned before, Guild Wars 2 and PSO2 would launch sequels the same year, right after Rusty Hearts would launch, basically stealing any chance the game had at any mainstream popularity, as they offered much higher production values and more content while being in the same sort of genre. I've made some Persona comparisons along the way, and while some of you might feel that that's quite the reach, hear me out. Imagine if Rusty Hearts, like Persona, though, had an entire portion of a game to complement the dungeon diving combat portion. In Persona, that's the going to school part, and the socialization part. These complement the dungeon diving portions of the game. None of that is present in Rusty Hearts, not even the collecting the Persona part, which leaves very little to do in the game besides just burn out on the combat. And many of the missions literally ask you to do the same missions over and over again to complete them to then progress to the next mission. Without more sums of parts, the majority of the weight just laid on the thing that was supposed to be good, but just wasn't good enough, both combat and dungeon diving wise. The questing was also rather standard fare, which didn't help matters either. The story quests were supposed to be the crowning part of the game, but were rather standard fare for titles that were much older in the space, feeling rather outdated and failing to impress. The normal quests are just NPC quests, which also tend to be more of the standard fare. And finally, the random quests are just repeatable wanted board quests. Without sounding too rude, much of what Rusty Hearts was offering outside of its unique bits was the same Korean grinder MMO ORPG stuff that many players were already bored of. Stairway Games wouldn't give up hope though, with the Requiem content update to hit not much later than launch, January 2012, which was impressive to say the least. With the update came a new premium character as promised, Roselle Virgirius, who utilized an axe and twin swords. The level cap would be increased, new items and weapons added, and then an all-new hub world set with new NPCs and dungeons. They also added a raid dungeon mode allowing players to play up to 8 players at a time. I think these were some good changes, but not having a premium character at the start seemed a bit odd, and worse, the new premium characters were closer to avatars of existing characters thus far, basically just allowing them to be played as another gender. In order to properly sell these avatars, they would have to have been full-blown characters in my opinion. You already have a lack of customization with the preset characters, now we have clones of the preset characters, and it's just no wonder the game would struggle to make revenue. Not to mention the game was being sold by Perfect World Entertainment as an MMO constantly. Meanwhile, they just added a raid dungeon mode that only allowed up to 8 players. So beside that and the hub zone, there's not much of anything massive in the game. And while there's nothing wrong with that, especially if the game was already designed and clearly made to be an ORPG, the problem is that when you start to market it that way, well, on top of Perfect World Entertainment's reputation being very bad, well, obviously that doesn't really help matters. Rusty Hearts' first expansion would launch a year after launch, dubbed the Reborn expansion, and it would boost the level cap yet again, add 85 more quests, a few hard encounters, 4 new dungeons, and 40 new story quests. Now on paper, all of this sounds quite impressive, and even all of that said, it's still sort of as impressive for an online RPG trying to grow. But Rusty Hearts had Perfect World Entertainment's expectations, with the reputation of them also keeping aspiring players away. These sorts of content updates are needed, but without a core game loop to keep players playing long term, won't be enough to keep players around. New content updates, especially expansions, have historically done very little to bring in new players at all. And if Rusty Hearts players were beating the game faster than content could come out by a country mile, they would be moving on, and for a free-to-play game, that's not really ideal. After a unique Japanese launch where Sega would publish the title of all companies, and it was complete with completely redrawn character arts, Rusty Hearts would come out with more content and their new update dubbed the Swordswoman of Darkness, adding yet another avatar with it. While the US version wasn't far behind the Korean version in terms of updates, the Japanese version was behind the US version reportedly, which would make it also struggle to find popularity. Stairway Games really tried and wanted to make a push into Japan with Sega's help, but picked a time where Sega was publishing their competition, PSO2, and well, the rest is pretty much history. PSO2, like its predecessor, would become one of the most successful online RPGs in Japan. Meanwhile, Rusty Hearts would have quite the quiet drop in the bucket by comparison. Rusty Hearts would also launch in China nearly 2 years after the original launch, which was a little bit bizarre to say the least, but they were sort of pushing uncharted territory in a sense, and had recently had the relationship with Perfect World Entertainment, a Chinese company. I don't believe the Chinese version was as unique as the Japanese version, nor had any unique features though. The following year, and it would be announced after just 3 years of life, that Rusty Hearts would be shut down September 15th, 2014. There was no announcement of what was next for Stairway Games in their post either. meaning that the death and shutdown of Rusty Hearts might have also been their end too. A number of years would pass and the community would save the day yet again, resurrecting Rusty Hearts in the form of a Revolution private server, which is still currently playable. Join the Discord for more information on how to play, which you can do largely solo, just like PSO. Revolution means that you can still play a virtual world that might not have been as popular as other major ones we have covered on this series, but brought some new, unique wrinkles that weren't really seen before. Now, going forward a little bit, I tried to track down what happened to the Korean developer behind the project, Stairway Games, and found that it seems that they have been spending the majority of their time, at least the last time that they were doing it, building Unity assets that they would sell on the marketplace. And the assets would look a lot like Rusty Hearts' assets, or a similar style. So it's clear that Stairway Games was a big believer in that style, but other than that, it didn't seem like they were really continuing to make online RPGs, which was a bit sad. With that music playing, we have reached the end of this timeline. That means that we have gathered more than enough evidence to solve this case. So, why did Rusty Hearts die? Literally. Well, if you weren't paying attention to the clues along the way, lack of alternative content, pay-to-win, free-to-play design, lackluster compared to its competition. It had a flawed game design, Perfect World Entertainment's reputation and handling. Random tidbit, but something that I've been getting lately is that I get a post every now and then that mentions, "Are you using a voice changer? Why are you using a voice changer? Why does your voice change from light and high voices like the story begins back in 2004? Why does it sound like the story begins back in 2004? Or why does it sound like the story begins back in 2004? It's like, oh, it's almost as if I can change my voice and I have a baritone voice. Wow, crazy. My last point is, detectives, I can't really understate how important reputation is for an online RPG, and thus online worlds. Think about it this way. If we have the ability to travel and populate Mars, but we hear that it's being handled by a horrible group of people who don't seem to care that much about anything other than profit and just milking you when you get there, you wouldn't really have a lot of people trying to join that world. That's kind of how these online RPGs and virtual worlds have to market themselves. You have to be that sexy home or world for players to dedicate themselves to. And if you're trying to attract MMORPG or MMORPG players at least, and in Rusty Hearts, the world itself is so lacking and unremarkable that the anime-based gameplay and unique visuals were going to be the only real thing to draw players in, and they just simply failed in the end. Thanks for watching.